Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang namasami. So I'd like to welcome you to today's Sunday talk, the latest in a series of talks all through the Vassa. And the title of today's talk is The Buddha's Answer to Armageddon, which might sound a very odd title to some of us, and probably is. But I thought it would, or has the capacity to open up some issues which could be usefully contemplated in terms of how we view the world and how we view the Buddha's teachings. So I'm going to do my best to try and offer some contemplations around these things. So I'd like to start with the word Armageddon itself. I think the word Armageddon is familiar to many Westerners. We've been brought up in a Christian environment and at least heard some of the words of the Bible. But for people from Asia, probably the word Armageddon has very little meaning, or maybe a very vague meaning to it. So just to start with this issue of where does Armageddon come from? Where does it originate? It comes from a book in the Bible called the Book of Revelation, which is the last book of the New Testament. And there's only one reference in the entire Book of Revelation to Armageddon. And yet this word has very much entered into the English language and has this kind of various heterogeneous meanings, which I'm just going to examine in a minute. But before I do that, let's just consider what the Book of Revelation is about, because the context within which this word falls is so important. And the Book of Revelation deals with the end of time, the end of things, the end of human history, the end of the world possibly, and what happens after death. So this is its basic subject matter. And this subject matter of the end of things is dealt with in all three Abrahamic religions. So I'll just briefly mention on each one. So Judaism. In Judaism, it's about the people of Israel. So it's called eschatology, the ending of things. According to Jewish eschatology, God will redeem the people of Israel by liberating them from captivity. Wherever they are, they can come back. They will reunite. The diaspora will come back to the land of Israel. And God will raise up again the temple in Jerusalem. And he will raise up the house of David, the royal house of David, as it once was. And from that royal house of David, there will emerge a regent. And that regent will be the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And he will usher in a new messianic age and lead the Israeli people into a period of prosperity and justice and peace. All the other nations will recognize that the God of Israel is the real God, the true God, and they will follow along with the Israeli people or Israelite people. And then God will raise up, I'm not sure whether it's the entire dead, but the righteous ones, and he will create a new heaven and a new earth. So that's the Jewish version. So you come to Christianity, it's got a slightly different spin on it. So the end of time is represented by the second coming of Christ. And the period before the second coming of Christ is a period of torment and tribulation for Christians who've sort of stayed loyal to the teaching or stayed loyal to the ideas that Christ has promulgated and to God's commandments. They will have a terrible time before this second coming of Christ. But then when Christ comes on back to earth, he will then face up to what they call the Antichrist, the complete opposite of Christ, who's pretending to be a Christ, and then there will be a big battle, and Christ obviously will win. And then that will usher in the day of judgment. and people will be separated into the saved and the damned, and we all know the story about that. So that's Christianity. And then Islam also believes in the Day of Judgment. So actually, apparently it's one of the main tenets of Islam. If you are Muslim, you have to believe in the Day of Judgment. And they say that before that happens, there will arise a deceitful Messiah. The deceitful Messiah will pretend to be what Jesus was. He will carry out similar actions like healing the sick or raising the dead, but he will do this through the use of demons. And he will establish a great sort of influence in the world. Many people will be attracted to his teachings. And in particular, there are 5 groups that will fall under his spell. This is rather amusing. Anyway, they are weavers, magicians, the children of fornicators, Jews, and Bedouin. But people will be very much influenced by this false Messiah. But Jesus, in the end, in the Islamic version, Jesus descends from heaven, and he and the false Messiah face up, and there's another, a conflict. And then at the end of that battle, it ushers in a new era, at the end of which there is the Day of Judgment. And apparently on that occasion, the sun will rise in the west. And then all the dead will be resurrected, and then they will be judged according to their actions and their faith. So you can see that there is a kind of consistent strain through these Abrahamic religions around linear time. God has created the world and mankind, and God will, bring that to an end, that there will be an end of history, that maybe there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So that's the basic kind of eschatology of these 3 religions. Now, what happens in the book of Revelation is the man who writes it or speaks it is a man called John of Patmos. It's not the Apostle John. And what he's doing is he's first of all writing to the churches in Asia, which probably means in Anatolia, and he's sending them a message. Now, at this time, we can understand this because this time you have the Roman Empire controlling all these regions. And these groups of Christians, not very large groups, are being very intensely persecuted, probably by Jews and by the Roman Empire. I'm not fully sure of this. But what John of Patmos is doing is writing to them to reassure them, to encourage them, and even also to admonish them. But he claims to be in the Spirit, and that I think he's being influenced by what he calls one like the Son of Man, meaning, I guess, Jesus. So this is familiar to Christians, some of these sayings. So this is some of the sayings he's saying from Christ to these churches. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I died, and behold, I live forevermore. I have the keys of death and Hades. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So this is familiar to Christians, this kind of language. And what's going on is there is an emperor called Domitian in Rome, and he is requiring that all his subjects refer to him as Lord and God, everybody. And they must also worship his image. So you can see that the repression of the Christians will be because how can a Christian acknowledge this emperor as Lord and God? How can they bow down to an image of this emperor? It would be very difficult for them if they're believing Christians. So they have to say no to this, and they're being taken out and executed, beheaded or whatever, and some are being sent into exile, like this John of Patmos. So that's what's going on. And his task, if you like, in this book is to raise them up and keep them faithful and keep going, because things will get better for you. So it's an amazing book. If you have a chance, have a look at the book of Revelation. It's full of signs and symbols and strange creatures. And I think it's had an influence on Christianity since then, which has been quite heavy. For example, it's there that you meet the Lamb of God. You meet angels who reap humanity. It's the idea of the grapes of wrath. There's the beast. There's Jezebel. There's the sign of the beast. There's the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. All these things occur in Revelation, and extraordinary things go on. But also an angel who seals the foreheads of the believers, of the people who have stayed loyal to Christ. So they won't be affected by all the cataclysms and disasters that occur to humanity. And the other ones who have followed the beast, they have the sign of the beast on their forehead and on their hand. And they're the ones who will really suffer when all these horrible things are unleashed on the world and on human beings. So this is this incredible book of Revelation. So anyway, the three most evil sort of beings in this book are the dragon, which is a representative of Satan, the beast from the sea, which is the Antichrist, and the beast from the earth, which is the false prophet. And these three all collaborate, and the false prophet is spreading the message of the Antichrist, and many people are sort of coming to believe in that. And then we are told that out of the mouths of these three beings emit foul spirits in the shape of frogs, and these frogs go around the earth talking to the kings of the earth, and they tell them to assemble their armies at a place called Armageddon. And Armageddon, I'll come to that in a minute, but anyway, the kings of the earth are to assemble their armies at this place, and then they will fight with the armies of heaven. So the armies of the kings of the earth, if you like, they are the armies of evil. They're led by demons, and then the army of heaven fights with the kings of the earth. And this is at a place called Armageddon. Now, apparently there was a hill called Megiddo, which was in this mountain range that separates the coastal plain of Palestine from the interior. It was a strategic place, and there were many, many battles fought there. So the writer of this book obviously thought the final battle between good and evil will take place in the same place. And in the Jewish language, it's called Armageddon. So there we have the word, it's a place. But it's become also this colossal battle between good and evil. So that's the origin of the word. Now it's interesting to note, how does this word develop as the centuries roll by? So most of people will have been either hearing the Bible or reading the Bible for many of those centuries. But as we get towards the 20th century, perhaps the faith is beginning to die out a bit. And there are fewer Christians around, but also there is the First World War, which was a massive conflict. It was an industrial war. Millions of people died because of the terrible weapons had been created by the industrial societies. And people were horrified, absolutely horrified, and devastated at the level of casualties. They began to refer to this war as Armageddon, or the war that will end wars. So that's where that term was going at that stage. And if you go on a few decades, it becomes more extended. So these biblical terms become more extended. So in 1979, there was a film called Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now was not about the ending of time. It was about the war in Vietnam. And then in 1998, there was a film called Armageddon. And that was not about a battle between good and evil or different forces. It was a kind of science fiction horror movie about an asteroid heading towards Earth. And this group of people have to go onto the asteroid, drill a hole in it, insert a nuclear weapon, and blow the asteroid apart. So this was the film Armageddon. The year after that, there was a World Wrestling Federation pay-per-view event called Armageddon. And finally, last year, in the British election, one of the leaders of one of the parties started talking about Starmageddon, the disasters or calamities that would afflict the country if Labour was elected. However, beyond all of this, we have this lurking fear, certainly in the West, maybe in other countries too, that eventually these nuclear stockpiles of weapons will be used, and we refer to that as nuclear Armageddon. So that's the setting. Now, what happened in the lifetime of the Buddha himself? did he have to face any warlike situations? Because we're told, this was a time of relative peace. The Buddha walked up and down for 45 years. He was preaching in the valley of the Ganges, meeting all different kinds of people, all different kinds of countries, and offering advice and giving teachings where he was asked to do so. And it was a time of relative peace, so he could do this easily. But that's not to say that there was no war at all. You had these different states that he passed through. For example, there were two kingdoms, Kosala and Magadha, which were growing in power at that stage. They had kings. And then you had these ancient tribal republics, like the Sakyans, from which he came, and the Kolyans nearby. And then there was something called the Vajian Confederacy. All these states were, at times vying with each other, and sometimes there was conflict. So just to talk about the different conflicts that he did face, because he had to face, as I understand it, 3 different imminent wars. Now, the first one concerned his own relatives, the Sakyans and the Kolyans, because he was descended from both of them. And these two peoples lived each side of a river called the Rohini, and the Rohini River flowed between them, and they drew on the water of the Rohini to irrigate their crops. And initially there was no problem. There was plenty of water. They had lots of water to water their crops with, and there was not an argument. But gradually, as time went on, they had developed more agricultural land. They cut back the forest. They needed more water. And on top of that, there was periods of drought. So gradually the water was beginning to decrease. But they could cooperate. They built a dam, and from the dam they used to take the water to irrigate their crops. But then there were further droughts, and the water really was shrinking very much. So the Kolyan workers, or agricultural workers, turn to the Sakyans and they say, look, we only need one more watering of our crops and they'll be okay. They'll be ready to harvest. Why don't you let us have the water and then you can come to us and we'll give you food if you need it? And the Sakyans say, no way, we're coming begging to you for food. The water belongs to us. So these two groups start sort of abusing each other and even getting into fisticuffs and things like this. And then they start abusing each other's lineage. This is, they start abusing the ancestors of the other group. And word trickles up through the society to the ruling class, that's the Rajas, and they become incensed that their ancestors have been insulted. So they start preparing for war. So these two groups appear, young men in battle dress, itching to get at each other and settle accounts. And that's when the Buddha appears on the battlefield. So he's nearby because he's come back to Kapilavatthu after he's been away from Kapilavatthu 4 years from his first visit. He's come back and he happens to be there when this crisis erupts. So he appears on the battlefield and he's revered by both sides, and they drop their weapons. Oh, I'm not going to kill anyone, Lord, don't worry. And then he gets them to settle down, and he's talking to the chief people on each side. And he puts a very important question to them. He says, which is more precious, the blood in the veins of your warriors or the water in the river? And they say, the blood of our warriors is more precious, Lord. So he gets them to start to reflect on the rationality of it all, the reason, why are they doing this? And then he also offers a teaching at the end of it. He says, if I hadn't been here, you'd have unleashed a river of blood. Ask yourselves, why do you act in this way? It's because you're blindly driven by your passions, and therefore you live in continual conflict. So he's made this very essential point, and they take it, and they don't have a war. Somehow they're able to settle the differences between themselves without engaging in a fight. So he has averted a war. But there's more to it than that, because he brought a sense of investigation to the situation. What was believed by both sides was that the Rajas on the other side, the other group, had insulted their ancestry, the Rajas on this side. But when the Buddha investigated, he found out that, in fact, the insults had been exchanged just between these agricultural laborers. The insults hadn't been coming from the rulers of the group, but just from these agricultural laborers. And once they know that, there's no problem, because they can just say to the agricultural laborers, don't talk like that, don't go, don't insult. It didn't come from the Rajas, but the immediate impulse to go to war was from the feeling of the insult, the humiliation that these people have been insulting their ancestors. So he's able to diffuse the process, the whole process of going to war, by investigating more and trying to find out more of the truth. And so what he does at the end of it is he tells a Jataka tale, which is about someone who believes, blindly believes in what everyone's telling him, and as a result he comes to terrible harm. Whereas somebody who is wiser investigates the situation, finds out more of the truth, and therefore doesn't come to harm. So this is called the Duba Jataka. But he also, when he leaves the battlefield, he goes back to the monks. He comes up with this very famous verse in the Dhammapada. Happily do we live without hate amongst the hateful. Amidst hateful men we dwell happily. So making the point that, monks and nuns can live peaceably together. They don't have to engage in this kind of rivalry or competition or abuse or hatred. So we can say that was one conflict which he was able to avert. It was, if you like, a success story. Now, the second conflict is a little bit more complex, but I'll try and explain the background because it's worth understanding the background. So this kingdom of Kosala was a very powerful kingdom, and it was headed by a king called Pasenadi, who was a loyal follower, very devoted follower, actually, of the Buddha. Which didn't mean to say he was living a very skillful life, but he was always trying to visit the Buddha and listen to his advice or get advice from him. And there was some problem about offering alms. He'd been trying to have alms offered and then it didn't happen properly and people were complaining and so on. And he thought, well, maybe out of this I could do something. The Buddha is a Sakyan, he's from the Sakyan clan. Maybe I can request the hand of a Sakyan princess. Because he's got a few wives already, but there's been no son. And the other thing to remember is that the Sakyans and the Kolyans, although they were very proud people and independent, they were vassals of Kosala. Kosala was strong enough to have them as vassals, so King Pasenadi was their overlord, if you like, their suzerain. And so he thinks he's conferring a great honor on the Sakyans. So he sends an emissary to the Sakyan Republic, asking for the hand of a Sakyan princess. And that's when the problem starts. Because the Sakyans are very proud people. And they believe, they're all Kshatriyas, they're warrior caste. They believe that they're descended from the sun god. And also that the Kolyans are descended from the sun god. So these two groups intermarry. But the other Kshatriyas, like King Pasenadi, they regard as a lower caste. He's a lower caste to us, and there's no way that we would send a Sakyan princess to marry someone of this caste. So what do? They've had a request from their overlord, can I have the hand of a Sakyan princess? And then they have this terrible pride that they can't do this. So the leader at that time was a man called Mahanama. So he comes up with a plan. He says, what we'll do is we'll send my daughter, Vasabha. But Vasabha is not his daughter. She's not legitimate. She's the daughter of a slave in the kitchen he's had an affair with. She's very beautiful, but she's a kitchen slave. So they raise up this girl and make her into a princess. They teach her how to behave as a princess. They give her beautiful clothes. And when she's ready, they send her off to Kosala to meet with the King Pasenadi. And he receives her. He's delighted. She's very beautiful. He happily gets married to her, and they have a son called Vidu Daba. So he's growing up in the court. He's a strong, forceful boy, and he's known as to be as quite stubborn, but also to have these terrible rages. Every now and then he has terrible rages. So he's growing up in that court, and at the same time, he's wondering, why don't I ever go to see my maternal relatives? Why don't I go and see the Sakyans? All I know is my paternal relatives and my mother. And he keeps asking, as he gets into his teenage, when am I going to see my other relatives? And of course, his mother, Vasabha, she's desperately trying to fend this off. She can see that if he goes and meets with the Sakyans, there could be huge problems because they think of him as a slave. And he's the heir to the throne of Kosala. So she's kind of fending this off, delaying it as long as she can. But eventually, at the age of 16, King Pasenadi gives permission to this prince. Okay, yes, you can go and visit your maternal relatives, and we'll give you a retinue and all the rest of it. So he travels. Of course, they give the advance warning to the Sakyans. So he travels with this retinue to Kapilavatthu, which is the Sakyan capital, and they receive him royally. They give him a wonderful welcome. But Mahanama has sent away all the younger relatives, so they don't have to bow down to this son of a slave. So all the younger relatives have been sent away into the countryside, so they don't have to do that. So they receive him, and they make a tremendous fuss of him, and there's feasts and all the rest of it. And then the time comes for him to go back to Kosala, and they're all getting on their elephants or horses or whatever. And then one of the attendants says, "I'm sorry, Lord, sorry, Your Majesty, I have to go back into the main chamber. I left something there." And he goes back into the main chamber, and what he sees amazes him, because the seat on which Vidu Daba had sat is being washed in milk by a servant girl. Why are you doing that? Because we have to clean the seat. It's soiled. He's the son of a slave. And the attendant is absolutely astounded, and he takes this back to Vidu Daba himself, who is absolutely enraged at the humiliation. So then and there, he swears a kind of promise. He says, "I will wash that seat with the blood of the Sakyans." But then he has to go back. He's still the prince. He goes back to Kosala. King Pasenadi hears the truth. He demotes them both his wife and his son, to the kind of kitchen area. They aren't a queen and a prince anymore. So they feel that humiliation. But then the Buddha intervenes and he says, "Your Majesty, look, she's your wife and he's your son, and could you please reinstate them?" So Pasenadi reinstates them both, and he allows his son to be the commander-in-chief of the army. So now you have Vidu Daba at the head of an army, and then on top of that, King Pasenadi is going to visit the Buddha somewhere where he's living. And whenever he goes into the cell where the Buddha lives, Pasenadi takes off his royal insignia. There are lots of things that indicate he's the king, and he gives them to one of his ministers. Then he goes into the cell to talk to the Buddha, like face-to-face, man-to-man. And then when he comes out, he takes his royal insignia again. But this particular minister has a huge grudge against the king. He's had a relative murdered by the king, which he can't forget. So when he's given the insignia, he thinks, what we'll do is we'll go back to Kapilavatthu now with all this entourage, and we will declare Vidu Daba king. And he leaves one servant woman who's to tell Pasenadi, "You're no longer king, don't go back to Kapilavatthu, your life's in danger." So that's what happens. Pasenadi comes out, there's no insignia, there's no group, there's no minister, just this one woman. She says, "You're in danger." So he decides to throw himself on the mercy of the other king of Magadha, King Ajatasattu. And he heads towards the capital there of Magadha, Rajagaha. And I think with one servant, he arrives at the city, but the gates have been closed. All that is available is a kind of poor, rundown hostel. He goes into the hostel with this one servant, and it's there that he dies. So he dies a pauper's death. This is a king who's had just about every kind of luxury and privilege that you can imagine. So he dies in this hostel. Meanwhile, of course, Vidu Daba has been declared king, and then he hears of his father's death. He's free to do whatever he wants. So this is when he unleashes this attack on the Sakyans. He says, "Assemble a huge army. We're going to go and settle accounts with the Sakyans." And that's when the army sets off, the Buddha hears about it. Now, at this stage, the Buddha is much older. He's no longer the young Buddha, man of the previous incident, but he heads for the road that leads towards Kapilavatthu. The Buddha heads for that road, and he sits under a very a tree that is, old and withered, very few leaves. So he's under the scorching sun, under this withered tree. And as Vidu Daba arrives with the army, he sees the Buddha. He says, "Blessed one, Lord, why are you sitting under this tree? There's no protection for you. Come and sit under this beautiful banyan tree in my territory, just over the border, and you'll have plenty of shade." And so the Buddha turns to the king, and he comes out with one sentence. He says, "Great king, the shelter provided by kinsmen," that's relatives, "the shelter provided by kinsmen is cooler. The shelter provided by kinsmen is cooler." And Vidu Daba does respect the Buddha. He venerates him. He is very struck by this statement, and he decides to turn around. He can't go on any further. So he turns the army around and starts going back to Kosala. And this event repeats itself 2 more times. He's so enraged once more, he's set off to come back to Kapilavatthu. Again, the Buddha is sitting there. Again, there's some kind of exchange. Vidu Daba turns, "Okay, we'll go back to Kosala." And a 3rd time it happens. And then on the 4th occasion, the Buddha can read the mind of Vidu Daba. He knows that he's full of absolute intense hatred and desire for revenge. It's not going to change. And on top of that, he knows, he can read or understand that the karma of the Sakyans is coming to fruition. The deeds they've done in the past will result in this terrible ending. So he doesn't intervene on the 4th occasion. So the Buddha will intervene up to 3 times to try to influence people, but after that, it's their own affair. So Vidu Daba and the army go on, they carry on, and they get to Kapilavatthu this time. And he orders the massacre of all the Sakyans, beginning with the babies. He does spare Mahanama and his family, but everyone else is to be killed. And then he says, "Okay, well, you can assemble 500 Sakyan maidens. I'll have them as a harem. And these women get together. These young women get together, and then he approaches them, and they say, 'There's no way that we would sleep with you. You're a low caste slave.' So he has them murdered as well and thrown in the ditch. So this bloodbath carries on, and most of the Sakyans die in the course of the bloodbath. And then finally, job done, everything settled, revenge complete. He turns around and starts heading back towards Kosala with his army. And then on the way, they decide to camp in a dry riverbed. There's a beautiful dry riverbed where they would be protected from the elements. So they set up their tents or whatever in this dry riverbed. But unknown to them, there's been very heavy rains upstream in the mountains, and this water suddenly pours down in a flash flood and sweeps them all away, or most of them. So they're drowned and they're washed out to sea. Perhaps a bit like the incident in Texas a few weeks ago. So that's the end of Vidu Daba and his army. So on that occasion, the Buddha hadn't been successful. Now, the 3rd occasion was a potential war that didn't happen, and this involves Ajatasattu and a minister. So King Ajatasattu is growing more powerful. He looks around him. What lands could I conquer? And right next to him, there's this Vajian confederacy. So he thinks, are they powerful enough? Are they strong enough to stop me? Will they defeat me? He's uncertain whether he's going to win or lose. So he decides to send someone to consult the Buddha. But what he says to his minister is this: "I will strike the Vajians who are so powerful and so strong. I will cut them off and destroy them. I will bring them to ruin and destruction." He says to his minister, "Go and consult the Buddha. Go and tell him what I've said and listen to his reply. Listen carefully to what he says, because Tathagatas never lie. So that's what this Vasakara, this minister, does. He goes to see the Buddha. He makes all the polite comments and bows to him and all the rest of it. And then he repeats this saying from Ajatasattu and listens to what the Buddha says to him. Now, on that occasion, the Buddha is sitting there and he's been fanned by his attendant, Ananda. And what he does is, instead of replying directly to Vasakara, the minister, he turns to Ananda and he says, Ananda, is it the case that the Vajians still hold frequent assemblies, that they come together often and discuss things? And Ananda says, yes, Lord, I think it is. I believe it is. And he says, well, when they do come together and when they part and when they hold business together, do they do so in harmony? And again, Ananda says, yes, I believe they do. And do they not abolish what has been authorized in the past and not authorize new things which have suddenly introduced new things? Yes, Lord, I believe they don't. They do or don't do that. And do they respect and venerate their elders and listen to them? Yes, Lord, I believe they do. Do they respect and venerate the Vajian shrines, both at home and abroad? Yes, Lord, I believe they do. Do they not abduct the women and daughters of other men and compel them to live with them? No, Lord, I don't think they do. And finally, do they support and give protection to arahants, so that arahants may be motivated to go and live among them? Yes, Lord, I believe they do. So 7 questions. And each time that Ananda gives the answer, the Buddha says they can be expected to prosper and not to decline. Then they can be expected to prosper and not to decline. So Vasakara is listening to all of this. He's not actually being talked to. He's just hearing this dialogue. And then he says, you're absolutely right. Even if they keep one of these principles, it will be impossible to defeat them. So we can't overcome them by force. What we have to do is create propaganda and sow dissension among these Vajians. So with that message, he goes back to King Ajatasattu. The war doesn't happen. He doesn't yet attack the Vajians. So in this case, the Buddha has been successful. So those are the 3 incidents that I'm aware of where there was a war looming and how he behaved at the time. So then the question is, how did he respond? What was the essence of his response to these different situations? First of all, I think he remained composed and calm. He didn't get emotional. He didn't say, how could this Ajatasattu attack these people who've done nothing to him? He could have said to Vidu Daba, why do you want to slaughter so many people? He doesn't do anything like that. He remains calm and composed. There's no knee-jerk reaction. He doesn't race back to Kapilavatthu to try to say, quick, there's an army coming and organize your defenses because you're all going to die. He doesn't say that, doesn't do that. He treats both parties with respect, for example, with the Sakyans and the Kolyans on the incident of the Rohini. And he doesn't give unwanted advice. He doesn't say, I don't think you should attack the Vajians, it's the wrong thing to do. He doesn't say that kind of thing. But what he does offer is a reflection that might mean something to the person who's listening. He's working to establish a kind of sense of reason or decency in the person who's consulting him or listening to him. So with the Sakyans and the Kolyans, he says, which is more precious, the blood or the water? And gets them to reflect on that. Which is more precious? And with King Vidu Daba, he says, the shelter provided by kinsmen is cooler. In other words, I'm one of them. And are you planning to kill all of those people? Which does influence Vidu Daba initially. And with the Ajatasattu, he's offers these 7 principles. The Vajians are still living according to these principles, which he taught them many years before. And therefore, they're well organized and they can't be conquered easily. So he's offering a reflection in a rational way that might influence the heart of the person who's listening to him. And he doesn't get caught up and lost in the whole thing. There is a sense of, okay, well, if it has to happen, then it has to happen. So he's not trying to control or desperately stop at whatever is happening. So that's how he responds, the level of response to those wars or threats of war. So we come to the main question, which is, what is the Buddha's answer to Armageddon? And I'd like to start again by reading a couple of verses. So these are the twin verses at the very start of the Dhammapada. Mind is the forerunner of all evil states. Mind is chief. Mind-made are they. If one speaks or acts with wicked mind, because of that, suffering follows one, even as the wheel follows the hoof of the draft ox. So that's evil states. And the twin verses, mind is the forerunner of all good states. Mind is chief, mind-made are they. If one speaks or acts with pure mind, because of that, happiness follows one, even as one's shadow that never departs. These are very powerful verses. They're the very start of the Dhammapada, if everyone have a look at that. What it suggests to me is this, that for the Buddha, Armageddon is a product of the human heart, of the human mind. That's where Armageddon comes from. Whereas if you look at the Abrahamic traditions, it's an inevitable result. It's God's vengeance on humanity. It has to happen. There has to be a battle between good and evil so that good can triumph. But in terms of the Buddhist teachings or the Buddhist attitude, the Buddhist approach, it's what we ourselves think and say and act. These are the seeds of the future, what we will experience. And therefore, it's not inevitable, but it is the result of human folly, Armageddon. So I think here we have this contrast between Christianity and Buddhism. From my point of view, Buddhism, maybe not always, but in general, it is a religion of cause and effect. Whereas Christianity, it seems to me, is about the relationship between God and man, this very complicated relationship. God has created man. Man wants things from God. He would perhaps like to please God, but he goes astray and does very wrong things, and God has to wreak his vengeance or wreak his punishment, which is what the Day of Judgment is all about. But what I think is crucial in the Buddhist approach is that war is utterly pointless and futile. If you think about the main thrust of his teaching, it's about the way to the end of suffering, that each one of us can walk the path to the end of suffering if we apply ourselves, if we follow the teachings, and if we practice to the best of our ability. When you think of war brings enormous amounts of extra suffering into people's lives. They become totally preoccupied with surviving and possibly with doing unskillful things like killing other people or harming other people in order to survive. So war is the complete opposite in terms of direction to what the Buddha teaches. Utter waste of time as far as he's concerned. So there is a saying from Ajahn Chah, some of you may have read it or heard it. The saying is this: human beings have only one problem, the problem of clinging. Because of this one problem, they will kill each other. Human beings have only one problem, the problem of clinging. And because of this, they will kill each other. So if we take that as the basis for understanding what I'm talking about, then looking at the areas of clinging and attachment, what are they? The main areas, it seems to me, that can result in a huge conflict or a cataclysmic war. The first would be, I believe, the area of sense gratification, attachment to sense gratification. So we have these 5 senses. We like to have pleasurable experiences. Now we also have the need to survive, the things that we need as a basic necessities of life. And within the Buddha's teaching on Vinaya to monks and nuns, he elucidates 4 different requisites, what he calls requisites. The first one is clothing for the body. We all need that to cover ourselves and to protect ourselves from the weather. The second is a meal for the day. If you get a meal for the day, you can survive. The third is shelter for the night. So in the Buddha's original teachings, this was very simple. It was the root of a tree. But it could be something a bit more elaborate, but usually was pretty simple. And the fourth is medicine and supports for the sick in times of illness and trouble. This can help see you through times of illness and trouble. So these are the 4 requisites he lays out for monks and nuns. You can have access to these requisites. And there are many things they can't have, of course. So if we take that as the basis, and I agree it's for most of us, it's a rather limited basis, but this is a society that we live in. If we contemplate the society that we live in, how much do people get what they need as against what greed says they need? If thinking about the standard of living in this society, in the West, in Europe and in the United States, North America, it's an extraordinarily high level of consumer provision. So let's think about this. In the 1960s, when I was a kid, usually it was 1 car per family. Nowadays it's 4 or 5, 1 car per individual. And that's in spite of climate change. We live in pretty comfortable houses with central heating. We have lots of luxury goods, which we expect now. Very high quality clothing, furniture, all the rest of it. Good food, obviously. Then there's the chance of going on holiday. We can fly to anywhere in the world, almost at the drop of a hat, which wasn't the case in the 60s. Flying was very expensive. So now, for example, if someone can fly to Cyprus for a wedding, or my nephew Ryan, who was a professional cricketer, he would fly to South Africa or Australia for a game of cricket, just for a game of cricket. And if anyone has followed the news or the developments in Ireland, I go to Ireland every now and then, there was the period of what they call the Celtic Tiger, which was the boom in Irish life. And I'm told that in Dublin, people with enough money would fly to New York for the weekend to do the shopping. Now, this is where we're at. These are the expectations that we have in the society. Now, what if these resources start to diminish? Partly climate change or the level of population. How much are we stuck on these sense gratifications? How much are we prepared to share and give up? If we're asked to relinquish and to reduce our demands in order that other people in other parts of the world can have a bit more, because they have nothing like what we have, will people willingly do this? How difficult is this for us? Because each time the standard of life rises, we assume that's the norm. And I've heard that with the cost of living crisis that we're going through at the moment, there is more and more shoplifting. So people can't give up the idea of they have those goods. They're going into shops and just taking them. So this is one area of attachment that could lead to very great conflict. And the Buddha's teaching is about trying to cultivate contentment and gratitude for whatever we have, rather than always wanting more, always wanting better, which is what the society teaches us. The society teaches us discontent. It's constantly happening through the advertising. So I like to suggest that this is the first area of attachment we would need to look at here. The second area of attachment is to do with views and opinions, because we tend to grasp onto a view and an opinion as being the truth. And anyone who challenges that view is a threat to us. They're wrong. And we have to show that they're wrong. So in Europe, the history is pretty ghastly. If you go back, it was religion initially. So we have, if you go back to the early Middle Ages, you have the Crusades, where we go to the Middle East and slaughter many Muslims. Or even within Europe, there were crusades against certain people who were reckoned to be believing the wrong thing. They had to be put down. We had the Spanish Inquisition. And then with the Reformation, we had Protestants and Catholics in different camps, and then there were wars between them, the 30-Year War, for example. There was a war here in England. And many such struggles between different religious sects, basically on the issue of views and opinions. People were exiled because they had a different view and opinion to what the church said they should have or what the monarch said they should have. So huge amounts of conflict around these issues. Then we come into the 20th century and we've got talking about political beliefs. The religious beliefs have died away more, but you've got communism, fascism, democracy, people very strongly attached to these views and opinions and having wars about that. So in the Buddha's time, it was more about views and opinions on religious issues, on debate matters between ascetics. So he came up with this verse, which I'd like to read to you. This is in the Sutta Nipata. So this is about views. How could one transcend one's own view if, drawn by desire, one is entrenched in a preference? Taking one's own to be perfect, one would speak as one understands. Based on a judgment, taking himself as the measure, he enters upon further disputes in the world. Having abandoned all judgments, a person does not create strife in the world. Those who are settled in views, who dispute, saying, "This alone is truth," do all of them receive only blame, or do some there also win praise? This praise is slight, not sufficient for peace. I say there are two fruits of disputes. Having seen this too, one should not dispute, seeing as security the stage of non-dispute. So very clear advice from the Buddha about views and opinions. And we're in this country, in this religion, we're asked to reflect upon attachment to views and opinions. How are we grasping those views? It's okay to have a view, but how do we regard them as the ultimate truth, and therefore everything else is wrong? So the third aspect, the third attachment I draw attention to, we're running towards the end of the talk now, is the national identity, the group that you belong to, the ethnic group perhaps. It might be a subgroup within a country, it might be a religious group, say we Buddhists, we defend Buddhists, or it might be even simply a political party or a football team, and we've got to defend that against people who are threatening it. So constant this creation of threats, and if we're threatened, then we have to organize to fight back. So there is propaganda, and we have to propaganda can shape people's views and opinions. And sometimes it's much easier to go to war than it isn't to go to war. You just get swept along with what the media is telling you or the government is telling you, and suddenly the other people, they've been dehumanized. They're no longer humans, they're just a threat to you. And then there is the possibility of the superiority. Our group, our nation, our race is superior to the other one. And although we try to work against this, we probably all tend to feel this in one way or another. Now, the worst form this can take is if you see another group as either a threat or maybe as terribly inferior or as a nuisance, that you want to get rid of them. And we can see this kind of thing going on at the present time. And the example I'll draw is one in Australia. So one of my uncles emigrated to Australia not so long after the Second World War. he had 3 marriages, and the third one was to a Yorkshire woman called Marge, whom I knew. Anyway, my mother visited them many years later, and they were all going on an old person's coach trip to Tasmania. And my mother heard Marge say this in Yorkshire accent. She said, "They should be wiped out," meaning the Aboriginals. And in fact, it was the case in Tasmania in the Victorian times that you could buy a license as a white settler and shoot as many Aboriginals as you liked. So the Aboriginal population of Tasmania, I think they were wiped out from there. So this is the kind of danger that this group identity poses and the attitudes that come with it. Now, in the teachings of the Buddha, what I would understand is this, that ultimately these identifications go back to the sense of asmimana, the conceit, I am. This is the root of it. We then extend out this identity to the group that we're part of. So it's asmimana, the conceit I am, ahankara, mamankara, I-making and mind-making, which are at the heart of this kind of identification and the prejudice that goes with it, or the reactions to threats. Now, the Buddha was very clear about caste and class and race. He said very clearly, this is not the ultimate truth. If someone is born into a low caste, it doesn't mean to say they're a low person. If someone is born into a high-class family of Brahmins, it doesn't mean to say they are a Brahmin, because Brahmins are Brahmins through action and speech. If someone is keeping a moral life, has transcended their defilements, has pushed back the obstacles to spiritual growth, that person is a Brahmin. Not the fact that they were born into a particular family. And also outcasts. What is an outcast? He had a debate with a Brahmin about this, because the Brahmin was calling him an outcast. And he says an outcast is somebody who does not respect life, who harms living beings, who attacks villages and towns, who steals, who, seduces the wives of relatives and friends, and all the other kinds of, who extols himself and denigrates others. That person is really an outcast. So those are the 3 areas of attachment or clinging I would draw attention to as possibly, leading on towards conflict. So each one of us can be aware within ourselves of the seeds that we ourselves sow in our own minds and the attitudes that we adopt and the attitudes that we cling to. Because this is where it begins. Now, within Buddhism, there is this understanding of karma. The seeds that are planted give rise to fruit at the end of the day. But I don't think it's purely limited to Buddhism. If you look at Christianity, there are sayings which are somewhat similar in tone. For example, the very famous one, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And there is also a saying about something called the mills of God. So it's a saying in Christian culture which Longfellow took and made into a poem. This is the poem, one short verse. The mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness he grinds all. The mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness he grinds all. So that's a kind of Christian version. It sounds more like retribution, but it could be considered to be karma. And Luang Por Sumedho, I remember one of the teachings he gave on a retreat which I attended, he said, nobody gets away with anything. That's what he said, nobody gets away with anything. So I'd also remind you that the Buddha was prepared to investigate the truth. He didn't just believe in the group mentality or in what he was told, to believe in. He would investigate, as at the incident with the Rohini River. what is the truth? What is really going on? And that's a very important aspect in how we conduct ourselves as human beings, I believe. And finally, just to mention that there is a clear difference between the Abrahamic religions on the one hand and Buddhism and Hinduism on the other. The Abrahamic religion, time is linear. There's a beginning and there is very much an ending. Whereas in Buddhism and Hinduism, time is cyclical. It's going round and round through different phases. And then there's kind of very beneficent phases and then declines and then a ghastly end period. And then somehow people come out of that into a better phase again. And that's the arising of a new Buddha, beginning a new era. So that's the kind of Buddhistic vision of time, and very different visions of time. So that's my attempt to look at this issue. It can be a pretty heavy issue, I suppose, but it's very interesting to see the way these different religions offer their teachings. So I offer this for your reflection at this moment. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Hi, would you like a microphone?
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I was thinking, with Armageddon, which is quite a sort of, in the lingo kind of word, but appropriated, I suppose. But what would you suggest with the present Armageddon that's going on now?
Which one?
Well, Gaza, really.
Well, this is political. I don't really want to get into politics.
Okay.
I know I touched in it sort of,
Yeah.
but that's why I chose Australia as the example, because
Because that's history.
horrendous.
Yeah. Fair enough.
But you can comment if you want.
What do you think, like if there's a conflict like that happening in one's time and in one's world, what do you think the correct way to respond to it is?
Well, as a monk, I'm not supposed to get into, as Ajahn Chah monk, we don't get involved in politics. Now, there was a monk here, Ajahn Dhammanando, who was ordained several years after I was. And he chose to get involved with political issues. First of all, he took time away in India because he was of Indian descent originally. And then he set up a website or a blog where he was commenting on political matters. So Ajahn Amaro had to write to him and say, this is not what we do in the Ajahn Chah tradition. And then he said, okay, well, I'll drop out of the tradition. I'll just be a monk on my own. So at one time he was advocating for LGBTQ issues, very strong on that. And then latterly I've heard he got involved with protests about Gaza. And someone said, how true this is, I don't know, that he might even have spent a bit of time in prison. So I don't know. But he had to separate out, from the Ajahn Chah, because we don't, for Ajahn Chah not to get involved in these political disputes. The reason being, obviously, that, we're open to everyone, to helping anyone we can, or offering teaching to any group. We don't want to be aligned with any particular group or against any particular group as far as possible. But I think the teachings of the Buddha are very clear on humanitarian issues, I'll put it that way. There's a lady there.
So you talked about time, Ajahn, and the cyclical nature of time as opposed to the linear nature of time. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Okay, I don't account myself an expert in this, but my understanding is, for example, in the Buddhist, from the Buddhist approach, they start by talking, basically what's important in Buddhism is the appearance of a Buddha and the teachings of a Buddha. So you have the appearance of a Buddha like Buddha Gautama, and initially the teachings make a very big impact on people, and there's a lot of interest, and monks and nuns practice incredibly seriously and sincerely, and of course they're helped by the extraordinary understanding that a Buddha brings to any situation. So we're told there were lots of arahants at the time of the Buddha. And then as time goes on, so gradually that begins to drop away. You have people living the life, wearing the robe, or lay people offering dana, but there may not be so much practice going on. You know, it's more like there's some practice going on, but not as much as there was originally. You know, perhaps I'm not saying people being, hypocritical, but they're perhaps not trying quite as hard, that kind of thing. And as we know, in some areas of the world, there's been quite a decline in standards. And then you get to a less advanced phase, a less prestigious phase, when people are really drifting away from the teachings. They perhaps still have a few forms of the religion. Their understanding is very limited. They don't really know what the Buddha taught. And then you finally get to the point where even the religion is being forgotten. And there's in fact a talk next week from Ajahn Dhammanando entitled Even the Sasana Will Die Out, I think it's called. So he'll be looking at that. But this is in Theravada Buddhism, they think about a 5,000-year period during which the religion will last, and they will gradually, like everything else, like any other sankhara, any other formation, the religion will die out. And then you have a period of absolute darkness when people don't have any kind of light or teaching to help them in their lives. And then it goes sort of in the text, they go to what they call a sword interval, where everyone's killing everyone else or doing very nasty things to each other, and the lifespan is very short. And then finally, out of that period, some groups of people remove themselves and live separately, try to live a more moral life and live in a more sensible way, a more considerate way to each other. And gradually from those beginnings, a slightly better era begins to emerge. And as things improve and improve and improve, so eventually there's the arising of a new Buddha, we're told. And that would be, the next Buddha would be Maitreya. And then you've got the teachings again and a whole new cycle coming in there. Hinduism, again, there's a cycle, but I'm not so clear on what it entails. Yes, gentlemen. Could you take in the microphone, please?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I was just thinking about, sort of grasping an achievement, and thinking about my own reactions to in politics or whatever, or if I feel, if I have a row with somebody or just disagree but don't show it, and the feelings that come up. And, I'm just sort of thinking, to follow the Buddhist path, is it just to stay out of everything?
No, I think it's try to be skillful.
Skillful.
What they call upaya or skillful means to get people to reflect. So if you actually directly contradict people and come into contention, you get their backup, and then they've got something to defend, and then you've got something to defend, and the whole process starts. But if you remember, there was a saying that the Buddha used, I am in contention with no one, I am a friend to all. So he was literally trying to help anybody he met and to befriend them, even if that meant offering sometimes a somewhat harsh reflection or a reflection that didn't please them. But he was trying to be their friend. He wasn't trying to just contradict them or beat them down or be in contention. So I think with politics, it's all too easy just to get into this kind of mode where they're wrong, I'm right, and that kind of thing. This is egotistical stuff, isn't it? So most of us are not quite as advanced as the Buddha in terms of how we respond to these situations. So I think it's really how we have to be careful. Yeah. Now, for example, a few months ago, at the time of the election of President Trump, we have an American anagarika who came to me and he said, "Can you answer me this question?" He said, "I've got these friends or relatives who support Trump, and I feel like cutting them off, and not talking to them. What do you say to that?" So I said, well, don't let that happen just because of views and opinions. Friends are valuable, relatives are valuable. Just because they've got different views and opinions, that's not a good reason to cut them off. So that's what I said to him.
That's very, very interesting. I have a friend I'll be seeing tomorrow. Well, he's not a friend, he's just someone who I know. And a gathering, and I mean, he's my thinking was, well, I'll just stay away from him. But just from what you say, I don't need to make that as as harsh as it sounds.
I think you can still enjoy a friendship. You just don't go towards that area if possible. Because I'm a rather, to be honest, I'm a Europhile. I'd rather we stayed inside of Europe. But I'd have two good friends who are both very convinced about Brexit, you see. So, okay, that's how they feel, But so I try not to go to that with them, just sort of talk about other things, because we can still enjoy a good friendship. And I just have to accept they have a very different viewpoint.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn. Really good talk and lots to reflect on. Just following on from that point about not upsetting friendships. My sister, her son-in-law is a Texan and a Trump supporter. And my sister was over there just before the election in Texas. And she was very well aware that it would be very easy to upset the family dynamics. Her daughter is very diplomatic, and they have 4 children. So my sister's way of coping was to not talk about politics, and she had a lovely holiday. And as you were saying, the family relationships are still very positive. So it's sort of a bit of wisdom in these situations that stay away from these contentious topics. And just as a sort of a general point, you talking about sort of conflict and contentious situations. So much of it, if we look at it, sort of very simply, it comes down to fear. A lot of it most of it is fear-based, and we can feel it in our bodies. This contraction. So, I mean, I'm full of admiration and awe for people like the Buddha who were able to maintain this friendliness, this attitude of friendliness, rather than going into being overtaken by fear. So it's just a reflection that I have, because I'm quite a fearful person, and I recognise that it's very difficult to actually sometimes practice this friendliness towards others.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That's a very, very interesting reflection. Very helpful.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. There's a lot of correlation that I see from cyclical time, like with the Hindu yugas and creation and destruction, those kind of things. And more enlightened economic thinking now sees these debt cycles and a certain pattern of human behaviour, war, peace, education, prosperity, and they kind of cycle through. The thing that is present right now is the belief in artificiality. So artificial intelligence will help us make things better, whatever better is. And the quest then for consciousness that is non-human. So where in the past we've had, as you were mentioning, problems driven by the heart and the mind of humans acting out in environments that involve other humans. What I'm seeing coming from a tech background is the quest to kind of displace the human from systems, with a promise on one hand of this utopia of we can all do more of these pursuits, right? We can understand ourselves. We can do more creative output. And on the other hand, fears of kind of subjugation and all those kind of things. But it very much seems something that, not quite on the false prophet side, but there's a lot of effort and communication around the benefit of these things. What I'm seeing in the economy right now, and in my industry, is a lot of displacement of particularly the younger generation and the graduates coming through now, whose skills are, by definition, more novice and more developmental. And it's the first thing that these systems are doing now. So the question I think around all of this is, in terms of a form of Armageddon, individuals being able to meet those basic needs, but more about that quest. What is that quest to bring in artificiality to help us solve our problems, and how would we deal with that in the world, I think?
Yes, well, thank you for the question, and we will have people will have different views and opinions on this, and I'm open to those, but I confess I'm something of a technophobe, and the slogan I've come out with recently is, because I watch what goes on in the monastery, the more technology you have, the more you need, because there's always something else that's going wrong, and you need something else to plug the gap. And then we have all generations of people now living through their phone and living through screens. And I think there's increasing recognition that, there's something missing if the people are trapped in screens the whole time, because outside there is nature. And, we're really part of nature, or we should be, it seems to me. We need to relate on some level to nature. And if we're always living inside the screen or the PlayStation or the computer or whatever, we are missing out on some very important ingredients. I'm not saying that technology can't help us, but it seems to me that there's a very linear way of thinking in the West, maybe now across the world. Just follow the line of development. Whatever comes up in terms of new technology must be good. And I'm not sure that's the case. It just leads us on into deeper and deeper into these areas. And, what are you going to do about mass unemployment if there is so much displacement, like you say? I don't know. It needs drastically new solutions, and this is a social problem. But for people who come to meditation, it can be very helpful to go into the body, and to start paying attention to nature as in the body, and then maybe being in quieter environments, and having our friend in Ireland talks about digital detox holidays. People are learning about this to recover from what modern life subjects them to, or what they feel they have to do. And I don't have any answers, except to say I think we need to be very cautious, and there are other yardsticks than just technological development. They can always come up with something new. For example, let's look at some of the things that were invented to great acclaim at the time and seem to be a liberation. One would be the internal combustion engine. My father practically danced around internal combustion engines thinking they were the most marvelous things that ever had been created. And yet, from that, we have now this carbon dioxide problem. We have a heating planet, or partly due to cars and aeroplanes. Now we wonder: was it as marvelous as we thought it was? And some would say, no, it wasn't marvelous. Another one would be plastic. I remember in the cinema in the 60s, you had these little short films in between the big films, And they were this wonderful creation of plastic, and they show all kinds of plastic being made and how the scientists were very brilliant. And I mean, in some ways it was true. Plastic came into everything, but we didn't know the after effects, the terrible after effects in the oceans and elsewhere, where we're destroying habitats and creatures through the plastic. And then finally, the other one, which I'll go to, is the atomic bomb. So at the time of its making, I think people celebrated the atomic bomb. You know, this has brought the war to an end. Thank goodness, we're not going to have any more soldiers dying on our side. But now we think, well, what did that bring in? You know, so each one of these creations or inventions was created to great acclaim at the time and considered brilliant. But later on, or maybe not. So that's why I counsel caution.
Thank you.
You mentioned in Christianity time is linear, whereas cyclical in Buddhism. I'd like you to elaborate. I'm confused. I'd like to know, well, my thinking goes to, is it predestined then? Is there already something set in stone? I also want to add something else. I have been having dreams since I was a teenager, and I don't realize it at the time after I wake up. Sometimes a month, 3 months, a year elapse before I realize that actually that dream that I had some time ago, I've seen this happen. And in my dream, and when my daughter, they're now in the library, but they were here during the talk, when she was 4, she woke up from a dream full of floods of tears, and she told me that what she saw in her dream, and I had no understanding of it. I comforted her, and about a couple of years later, what she told me happened, and it took me some time to realize. And it was that she saw that I was very, very ill. So this concept of time is very interesting. So I'd like you to elaborate more.
Well, I don't know about predestination. I don't think that the Buddha's teachings really goes with that. That's more a Christian concept. And some Christians may accept it and some may not. Within the Buddhist framework, we would say there's freedom to choose. So, for example, with this karma, there's the results of karma. We've arrived as we are. We can't do everything that we want or achieve everything we want, but we can do some things. That there is a limitation on what we can achieve because of the karma that we've come from. Of course, the Western says, oh, no, we can do anything you want. But the reality is there's certain limitations imposed by the karma, but there's still the choice, the freedom of choice, how to behave within that. So I don't think we would accept at all predestination. But what I think you're talking about is premonition. And I certainly believe in premonition. I've had many, many premonitions in my life. And one was, I remember being at university and I was a sort of naive young man, but there was something going on between me and a young woman. We used to meet by chance, and she was the girlfriend of a friend of mine. And these dreams started coming up long before it. And then, lo and behold, I was going out with her and she had left this other guy. So these dreams were very worrying to me at the time. But another example of a premonitory dream would be a young woman who was going to travel on the aeroplane that got blown up at Lockerbie. I don't know if you remember this. It's 1988. It was an American airplane. Can't remember the number of it. But she was on the phone to the States before before the flight, before the day of the flight. And her aunt said to her, "What's the number of your flight?" And she told her. And the aunt said, "Please, don't go on that one. I've had a dream." So she changed her flight and she survived. Or she would have been blown up over Lockerbie. So we can't dismiss these things. There's something there, isn't there? Some intuitional contact that maybe occasionally gives us glimpses of what the future might hold. I don't know. I can't fully understand it, but I think dreams are part of it, and maybe feelings. We have gut feelings about somebody or something. We feel a bit uneasy, and it can be a kind of premonition without knowing the full story. Does anyone else want to talk about that or have any experience of premonition? There's somebody with a hand raised there.
You get people like Nostradamus, who lived in the 16th century, and he made forecasts even to the current day, and many of them have come true. I mean, he looked several hundred years in advance. How could he do that if time wasn't cyclical? If these things already hadn't happened? For example, he predicted about Hitler, and he said, "I can see him riding in an iron cage." He didn't know what a car was, obviously, but and so on, you know. And a number of things that he predicted came true. So that would presumably imply that time could be cyclical.
Frankly, I don't know, but I know this. If you read Nostradamus, you can read many things. Some of them came true. There are many things in his verses. I've read a bit of it, and many things didn't appear to come true as well. So, yes. I don't know whether it proves that time is cyclical because, you know, in terms of inventions like the car and so forth, are we going to go round and round inventing the car? I don't think so. But in Buddhist terms, it's cyclical. You know, you have virtuous eras and the era of decay and dissolution, and then sort of the depths, and then rising out from that. And I think Hinduism was something similar. Maybe age of gold, age of iron, like that. But whether you can talk about, you know, he would have seen Hitler in his car in the past, I doubt it. These are things beyond my compass. Sorry. Anyone else want to?
Thank you for the talk, Ajahn. If the Buddhist view on time is it's cyclical, where are we now in the cycle?
Oh, that's a nasty one, isn't it? Well, we're 2,600 years on from the Buddha, and according to most Theravadan commentators, it's a 5,000-year cycle. So quite where we are, I mean, some people would say, like I've met a monk in Australia called Bhikkhu Sujato, who became quite famous because he ran a blog. Particularly at the time, there was a lot of kind of debate going on in the Sangha about nuns, and his blog became very famous or infamous in the sense that he attacked a lot of people. I know the man, we got on okay, but what was I trying to say? It'll come back. Can't remember. I know. No, sorry. It's Bhikkhu Sujato who said on his blog, he said this, he said, Thai Buddhism is rotten to the core. So I put this question to Ajahn Pasano a few years ago. I said, this is what Bhikkhu Sujato said in his blog. What do you think? Ajahn Pasano's response was as follows. He said, Thai Buddhism is rotten, but not to the core. So there are many aspects of the Buddhism in Thailand that are not very inspirational. Recently there have been more events where, I can't remember, it's about monks and corruption and things like that, and money, lots of money. So it's not very inspiring, but there are these, practice monasteries and forest monasteries, which are still very, very impressive and worthy of respect. So that's why we've, gone down the path of Luang Por Chah, and hopefully we can keep that kind of standard going. But that's not to say that there aren't aspects. Some of the tree has gone rotten, but there are aspects that are still very much alive and fresh and producing good shoots. I think that's how we put it. Yeah. You have to push the button on it.
Yeah. So in terms of, just now you talked about identity and how, we cling to things. Now, we cling to things to make a sense of who we are in this society and to survive. Because when we cling to things, then we know the differences and we're able to identify kind of our location or of who we are, basically, and how we're different to one another. But this clinginess and this attachment to your identity, also your ego, sometimes gets a little bit too big, out of control. And so therefore, you fall into your desires, or sometimes you cling too much to your identity, and when it dies off, you suffer. Now, I just want to ask if, what's your suggestion for the younger generation, or for young people like us that still has to go through, marriage, careers, or just life in general? How do we work with this sense of identity in our ego?
There was one expression you said: when it dies off, you suffer. What dies off?
For example, if I identify with my fame, if my fame dies off, I suffer. If I identify with my face, of how beautiful or young I am, when it dies off, I suffer. If I identify with the money I have, when it's gone, I suffer. When I identify with my health, things like that, so on. So how do we work with it? And
Well, one of the core teachings, as you already know, is impermanence in the Buddha's teaching. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. So impermanence, suffering, and not self. While we're young and we have lots of energy and strength and a lot of choice in life, these things don't seem so real. But as the body ages, they become more and more real, and we realize that yes, it's all impermanent. There's nothing that lasts. Well, if we have that conviction, the body doesn't last. The mind is constantly changing. All around us, people are changing, and in the end, they're passing away. So if we hold on to any of these things, we are going to suffer. This is the teaching of the Buddha, and we have to learn to live with the fact that things are, they are unstable. They're transient, they're changing all the time, and there's no final I identity. But what the Buddha's teaching is that this is a liberation. You can live with these truths and be happy, because you don't have to be somebody. So this is hard at your age, you're encouraged at your age to make your mark in the world and to establish your success, and in one way that's fine, but I remember coming to the monastery and people were, there was various slogans, this was the 80s, and one was, nowhere to go, nothing to do, no one to be. I found that very helpful. I've been caught up in a kind of professional career and striving to achieve this, that, and the other. I wasn't totally disillusioned with it, but there were limitations. I could see strong limitations to what I was doing. So that kind of slogan, it might sound a bit pat, but it was very helpful to me. So the monk's life is not really about achieving anything in terms of, fame or glory, but just trying to be present and to be as useful as we can to the people around us and to the situation around us, to try to practice the teachings, put them into effect, and live as closely as we can to what the Buddha advocated. And of course, we're all imperfect. We're all humans and we make mistakes. But it seems to me the modern world loads more and more on people. That's why we have so many. The amount of time now spent talking about mental health is incredible, isn't it? And they say that particularly young women who on the internet and so on, they seem to go through terrible periods of mental health. And I can't claim to understand all of that because I haven't been part of that generation. But I go back to this thing about, it's important to be in touch with nature as much as we can, taking a break from obviously the gadgets and all those screens and everything, taking a break from cities, getting out into nature. This is where you can find renewal and recreation, a reconnection with the earth. And this is very wholesome and helpful. So that's all I can make a suggestion about, So have these breaks away from your achieving and your kind of current identity and existence. Get out into nature and find a different kind of relaxation. I think that will be tremendously helpful to you as a person and to anyone else who tries it. That's my recommendation anyway.
Yeah, kind of like a follow-up question. It's just that if, let's say, like I said just now, and like you have said, if your identity constantly changes and everything is impermanent, then therefore that identity cannot be you. All right. So a question that I constantly ask myself and contemplate upon is therefore, who am I? If I'm not this body that dies, this mind that changes, and this appearance, and, so basically, yeah, who am I?
So this is used, I remember Luang Por Sumedho teaching this in the first retreat that I went on, which was many, many years ago. And he would teach this who am I practice. He'd been doing the who am I practice before he met Luang Por Cha. And the idea not was to a serious question about who am I, but the effect in the mind, because this is a question you can't answer. And he would say, well, when you ask yourself, who am I? Observe the gaps between the words. There's an emptiness between, if you thinking to yourself the words and you visualize the words in the mind, who am I? And then you might see a gap between the words, and particularly you might see a gap after the question mark. And sometimes I felt I did, it's a kind of sense of emptiness there, which I found very helpful. If the mind can go into that emptiness, it's a place of true relaxation and rest.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of days ago, I recall having I can say a discussion among a Christian friend, a Muslim friend, and I. Right. Now, I don't identify with any religion, but I do practice Buddhism. it's almost been 1 or 2 years since then. But throughout these discussions that I've had with different people, I started to come to realize that it's sometimes a little bit frustrating when how'd you say? It's a little bit frustrating when when I listen to one's opinion or one's perspective, I can't really explain my perspective to them because of different experiences that I have had. So when one engages in these kind of talk, how should one, carry themselves? Should they be a listener more than the one who offers perspective? And how can one, let's say, kind of show them, how Buddhism is, for example?
Okay, thank you for the question. Firstly, there's no harm in listening. The problem in the world is that people don't listen to each other, and they keep repeating what they have been taught, or kind of like running a tape through the head, and they're talking at each other, and nobody's listening to anyone. So that's the big danger. So if we can actually practice listening and bearing with whatever difficult feelings arise, feelings of awkwardness or feelings of disagreement or feelings even of repugnance, and not reacting to that, then we're actually bringing some benefit to human discourse in the world. And in terms of, if you don't set out to persuade anyone or convert them, that's the best attitude. Just if you can offer help to someone when they express a need, or when whatever they're holding on to is letting them down, that might be a way. Or currently in the society here, people want to meditate. They want to learn to meditate because of stress and the pressures on them and all the rest of it. So we do get a very, very high number of people coming every Saturday to the Saturday meditation class. And so it's just what is useful to these people at that particular moment. No one's out to convert them or persuade them that Buddhism is the way for them. It may not be. And also there are people who come to the monastery, they benefit greatly from being here, but at the end of the day, they incorporate what they've learned into their own faith, whether it's Roman Catholicism or Islam or maybe Sikhism or whatever, and they can use it beneficially within their own faith. So really, Buddhism is not about converting or persuading people, do become a Buddhist, it's the best way. We don't do that sort of thing, but we can offer them tools. So the Buddha left behind tools and techniques to employ in your spiritual journey. This is what he really left behind, like a toolkit. And we can bring out aspects of the toolkit that might help anyone at any particular time. If after that they think, Buddhism might be useful, might be helpful, then that's fine. But it's not our job to make them believe that. So, listening, responding in a way that's sympathetic and understanding, and maybe offering 1 or 2 insights, I think could be the best response in those situations. Is that enough? I don't know. Any other questions or points? You're very welcome to make a point.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. That was very insightful. And I loved the 3 stories where Buddha had the opportunity or was placed in a situation where a war could or couldn't have happened. I wasn't aware of them. They're very engaging. One of the stories where he wasn't able to stop the war was when a petulant individual who felt insulted because someone just said that he was a son of a servant, which was the truth. And that led to the destruction of an entire city or an entire race. And Buddha was, based on the story, considered someone who people revered, and his suggestions or his views on something would be respected. So from his point of view, he would have known that just trying to stop the king 3 times and not actually stopping the war could lead to so much of destruction, yet he only chose to give the king a very short answer. And it seemed like the king was being quite childish. His reason to go into war was because he felt insulted. So I find it quite interesting that Buddha didn't, knowing quite well what a war would lead to, didn't just try and sit with that king and try to explain to him that this is childish or, very petty. Instead, he chose to say the same thing 3 times to a person who seems is a childish person. So he wouldn't have understood this deep meaning of his sentence. So I just find it difficult to comprehend why he didn't, go a little further to try and stop this destruction from happening, and why it was a wise choice not to do that.
I think he could see into the karma of the situation. This is perhaps most fundamental, that the Sakyan people had done various things and there was action creating results, and those fruits were coming in, were ripening in the form of Vidu Daba. But I honestly don't know more than I've read. That's the honest truth. I haven't sort of sat through Buddhist Sunday schools and heard endless stories. But, it interests me that the Buddha would accept, 3 times I've done what I could, but now I have to let go. Because he can't control the world. He can try to influence people and bring out the best in them and get them to understand the results of their actions. But maybe he understood that Vidu Daba would never listen. He felt so humiliated and so bitter that he was the son of a slave, that nothing would stop him. The only thing that would sate his anger was the death of the Sakyans. So I really don't know. But it seems to me that the Buddha acknowledged he's not in control of the world. He's trying to influence people's hearts and their understandings. But at the end of the day, we are free to do what we choose to do. And if we make bad choices, we get the results. Yes?
Thank you. Just extending that onto the topic of, or significance of 3. So the Buddha intervened 3 times, Holy Trinity, 3 strikes, you're out. What is there any significance to the 3 interventions or 3 opportunities before then an outcome is decided?
I really don't know, but I know that, in different contexts at different times, different numbers take on this very important role. So within Revelation, it seems to be the number 7. If you read Revelation, this number 7 keeps popping up. And then there's this number of the beast, 666, which occurs in Revelation, and people know about that. So at different times, different numbers have different significance. We bow to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, so we do lots of things, it's a threesome. Beyond that, I can't really answer the question. But,
thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah. Any other points? Very welcome to ask if there is anything. Okay, we've got to 4 o'clock, so I think that's the time we wind it all up. So I'd like to thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. And hope to meet you again one of these days. So good luck with your understanding and your practice. And don't be downhearted. Each one of us can make a good difference to the society we live in if we put forward the right effort. Don't be downhearted. Don't be depressed. Don't give up. Have a good afternoon.